Okay, thank you all again so much for joining. This is our second Race Equity Leadership meeting. These meetings allow members to share how they operationalize equity-centered policies and procedures with a goal to enhance the collective leadership skills within the network. Today, we are joined by Michele Mackey, who is Executive Director of Kids Forward, and Nicole Hoffmann, who is Strategic Growth Director at Kids Forward in Wisconsin. They'll be discussing how to implement an anti-racist financial infrastructure within your organization and along with your board members. So without further ado, I'm going to
Hey, everybody. It's nice to see you. I'm going to pass on to Nicole very quickly. She's been with our team for going on 3 years, I think, and came to us very excited about racial equity and anti-racist work. Wisconsin, about 10 years ago in Madison, our capital city, we did a race to equity report where we compared the white experience to the Black experience of living in Dane County. And if you know Madison at all, it's a progressive city. It's the capital city of Wisconsin. It has the R1 university. So everybody was very surprised to see the results of that report that showed that Black families live under egregious racial disparities. And so when Nicole came and applied for our fund development director at the time job, she was like, I read this report. I completely shifted the way I think about fundraising. I've attempted to do this work in the organizations that I've been in, and I'm very excited about the opportunity to come to Kids Forward. So we snatched her up, and she has done amazing things at our organization and is really one of my co-conspirators in trying to create an anti-racist policy center. And so without further ado, Nicole, but since I actually don't even know all of you on the call, I became CEO of Kids Forward about 3 years ago. I would love it if you could put in the chat where you're from and what your role is in your organization. Thank you.
Thanks. It's so nice to meet everyone and to see you all here. Well, we talk about how we've been changing our fundraising, but not only our fundraising, changing how we look at finances for the organization and how we're doing that to reflect our organizational values. I am just going to open my notes a little separately. So we've got a lot of information to share, but we want you to ask questions and be engaged with us while we're sharing all of this information. We're going to give you a little background on our organization, a little history of fundraising, and then talk about our community-centric fundraising approach, and then collaborative financial management and how we've been doing that within our organization and the successes and challenges that we've seen from all of this, and then have lots more time for questions also. So our organization is over 140 years old, and we're the oldest multi-issue child and family advocacy organization in the country. In 2020, we announced that we were transitioning to an anti-racist policy center. We had, in the very early days of our 140 years, been focused on poverty. And in the 2000s, that changed for us to a racial equity focus. And in 2020, we made the announcement that we would be focusing on anti-racism in our work. And so what that means is that we're engaging the expertise of the people that are most impacted by inequitable policies in Wisconsin. And we acknowledge the necessity of consulting that lived experience and uplifting BIPOC priorities and championing those recommendations for policy change. And what that means for our organization right now is that we have our first Black and Latina leader. We have a multiracial team, and we are working as an anti-racist policy center. And in our work, that means that we are constantly practicing unlearning, reimagining, and building better what our work looks like. And in that process of unlearning and reimagining, we do need to acknowledge the harms and the problematic history of a lot of the work that has been done. And so when we are looking at fundraising specifically, let's see. Here we go. Fundraising has a history that is steeped in white supremacist norms that celebrate people of wealth. And these norms a lot of times leave our organizations what we can get while we modify our work and allow wealthy folks to determine what our communities need. And they don't reflect our organizational values and principles centering social and economic justice. In the 1800s, the philanthropy and fundraising has been around since the 1800s, and this is like centuries at this point of this kind of work and how it's been happening. A lot of times we are talking nowadays about the third sector. There's the government, the business, and then the nonprofit sector. And so that third sector has been around since the 1800s. And the wealthiest folks have been extracting labor and exploiting different groups of people. And in that, there has always been a need to help others. And so in 1913, it was the first year that the government recognized the nonprofit industrial complex, and charitable organizations officially became tax exempt at that time. And so then there's a tax mandate put on the highest income earners to support community. And in 1917, it was the first year that donations to nonprofit organizations officially became tax deductible to help encourage that philanthropy. But the interpretation of those policies has shifted. It shifted right away from creating social change to avoiding tax payments. And so the wealthiest people were using those tax policies to benefit themselves and their own accumulations of wealth. And the system continues to work like that today to benefit the folks who are the most wealthy. I pulled some numbers through quarter two of 2021 for Mackenzie Scott. She has continued to grow her wealth even while she's been making billions with a B, of dollars of contributions to organizations and to community. And we know that she is not directly responsible for the exploitive labor practices of Amazon, but she's directly benefiting from that system, and continues to benefit from that system. And communities are fairly lucky because she has agreed to contribute the majority of her wealth to philanthropic causes. But the fact remains that she is still continuing to benefit. And so the big elephant in the room is that we have this long history of fundraising that's rooted in white supremacy and racism, and we still need to raise money. And the system for so many years has been focused on donor-centric fundraising, where we have portfolios that cater to the wealthiest people, where we spend a lot of time in our roles designing the best ways to recognize and celebrate those wealthy people for the contributions that they're making. There are metrics and strategies and trainings and organizations that are built and created around donor-centric fundraising and how we can continue catering to these folks. And so the question that we had to ask ourselves at Kids Forward was, how can we raise funding that we need and simultaneously reflect our values of justice and systemic change in our work. And so when I came to Kids Forward in late 2018, I was looking at a fundraising plan. This fundraising plan is just our unrestricted income as an organization. So I was looking at a fundraising plan that was bringing in about 10% of the organization's total revenue. It was between $125,000 and $140,000 annually. Historically, our fundraising at Kids Forward has been very transactional. It included events and day of giving and mailings and online activities. So we always knew exactly what was coming in the door and when that was coming in the door. And so my first priority in the remainder of that year was to focus on relationship building so that we could get to know our donors. And we modified our fundraising efforts so that we were focusing on that relationship building. We were still doing a number of the transactional elements so that we could engage the majority of our donor base and the annual check writers. And of course, we increased our revenue. So in 2020, we had budgeted a modest increase up to $150,000. And we ended with a modest increase of $170,000. So we had budgeted, focused on relationship building and budgeted for growth, and we saw growth, and it was nice. It was exactly what we were hoping would happen. But it was still falling under this donor-centric fundraising model while we are focused on our donor relationships. And so it still wasn't reflecting our values as an organization. And so in 2021, we began, oh, see, my little mouse is out of control. Sorry, everyone. We began our transition to an anti-racist policy center. And so while we were changing our policy and engagement work to reflect our anti-racist values, we also needed to change internally as an organization, and that included changing our fundraising work. So what we knew is that we knew we couldn't risk our funding, all of our unrestricted funding as an organization. And so we decided that there were areas where we would make some cuts to our fundraising. So we decided that we wouldn't do events anymore, or we wouldn't do specifically fundraising events where we celebrate people in this hierarchy of gold, bronze, silver, platinum donors. And then we also weren't going to do our spring appeal anymore. And so that brought in about $5,000 annually for us as an organization. The event brought in about $40,000 for us annually. It was all fairly modest, but those were the areas we were going to shift our focus away from. And so we were risking about 1/3 of our entire fundraising budget when we started making these changes. So our initial focus was to strip the traditional hierarchy away from fundraising events. And we really wanted to make philanthropy accessible to everyone. The other thing that we did is we committed to flexibility. There is no anti-racist fundraising how-to manual. There is no guide to teach us exactly what to do or how to do it. And so we knew that we wouldn't get everything right away, but we wanted to give ourselves space and time to make changes until we did get it right. And so the first area that we shift our focus to in fundraising was our program called Partners in Equity. And so this was developed as a monthly giving plan created to engage donors at all levels of the organization, or at all levels of giving. I lifted this section that you see on the slides directly out of the original plan, and that plan's been modified a little bit because we've been flexible and we've been making changes. But so I would add to these goals that we wanted this group to be equitable. We wanted to recognize gifts at every level in the same way, and we wanted it to be inclusive, engaging all of our donors at all giving levels. And so in order to do that, we created a model. There it is. It's our Give, Learn, and Act model. And so we are, as part of asking people who want to be partners in equity for a monthly gift. And as little as $1 a month would include somebody in our Partners in Equity Giving program. We would provide learning opportunities for all of these donors. These are folks who are obviously committing to the long-term changes that that we want to see and to long-term systemic change. And so we wanted them to be involved in learning that process with us. And so we have been hosting virtual learning opportunities, and we just had one this year on the budget. Our state biennial budget is happening, is in the process right now. And so we had a deeper dive into the state budget than a lot of the fact sheets and things that we've been providing to the community at large. We also hosted one on what does an anti-racist organization look like. So they've been deeper dives into the work that we've been doing as an organization. And we wanted to provide opportunities for folks to take action. And so we asked them to sign up for our action alert list when we ask people to reach out to legislators and update them on policy changes and our positions on those things. So the Give, Learn, and Act model has been working really well. We rolled out Partners in Equity at the end of October in 2021. This next slide is the results as of early 22. Oops. Where did it go? Oh, so there we go. So okay, my hand is off my mouse. So in 2021, when we started this, our monthly donors, we had 3 monthly donors to our organization. So monthly, that included gifts of $85, and annually it was just over $1,000 that we knew we could count on every year. After year end of 2021 and early into 2022, the first stage were 13 individuals that were giving gifts ranging from at the time it was $5 to $100. And annually that was $7,000 for us. So the annual increase was almost 600%. And I know when we're working with numbers that small, that percentage looks really, really big. But we had a huge increase in people who are committed to long-term systemic change and helping fund that change. So now at the end, or at where we're at in 2023, we currently have 17 partners in equity. And so the numbers are increasing slowly, and they're increasing. It still is a significant increase for us. So this really took the place of our spring appeal. So earlier I mentioned that we pulled out our annual event and our spring appeal. That spring appeal was bringing in $5,000, and we are well over, have raised more than that $5,000, replacing the focus on that work to the focus on partners in equity. The next step that we took, and Michele, I'm going to ask you to chime in on this one, was we created an anti-racism leadership discretionary fund. It was created specifically to give Michele, as our new CEO, flexibility on how funding is spent based on Michele's lived expertise and experiences. So we, a really great example of this, right before we started this fund and realized that there was a need for it, we had worked on a podcast, and we had signed a contract with the producer of the podcast. And the producer that did the work, but that work that she was doing, it fell into the time frame of George Floyd's murder. And the producer came back to us and shared that they did not realize the emotional toll that the work was going to take on them, and that they felt that they undervalued themselves in that contract. And so what we were able to do, what Michele was able to do, was to pay an additional stipend to this producer, so that we could pay a fair value for the lived experience that they were bringing to the project and to the work. And so those are the kinds of things that we use this anti-racism leadership discretionary fund for. It also is used to fund consultants that we have been bringing into the organization as we've been doing, working through our anti-racist transition as an organization. Michele, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so this was actually a condition of my taking the CEO role. I had been COO at Kids Forward, and as COO, also serving as CFO, and really helping to restructure and more professionalize financial management at Kids Forward, and had just seen the impact of the way that we had historically done financial management on the executive's ability to fund both the transition that we needed to do in terms of internal learning, in terms of professional development, and on being able to appropriately value the contributions of community members and folks with lived experience. And so when I was talking with the board about taking on the CEO role, I told them that we needed to find a way that would allow for a lot more flexibility if we're going to be an anti-racist organization. One of the things that Nicole and I often say when we're talking actually about this is that we view this as a workaround. We think that anti-racist organizations shouldn't need to have a sort of designated funding source in order to do this work. It should be able to be within the systems. If it can't be, then that's indicative of the systems not working and not being right, not being just. So we haven't gotten to the point yet where we're able to really get rid of a CEO discretionary fund in order to do our mission. But we're working with our board on thinking about what governance looks like if you're an anti-racist board, and seeing what we can do to adjust the financial systems in a way that are consistent with our mission. And you don't need to provide a discretionary fund in order to actually do your mission. But I think probably a number of you who run organizations probably have similar experiences with trying to allocate for something, and it just not quite working out given the nonprofit industrial complex. So I appreciate I had several champions on the board that really helped me make this happen. And so I think that's also really important that you have champions on your board that can also see the challenges.
Thank you. That was great. And so when we implemented this originally, in addition to the champions on the board, we had a prospect list that was focused on allies in the work. We had set an original goal of bringing in $150,000 to fund the discretionary fund. And we created opportunities for folks to come on board and have coffee with Michele so that they could hear and learn from our leadership about the impact of this kind of investment on the culture and change work that was happening in Kids Forward. So these were small group conversations that we hosted, and within those conversations, we did individual follow-up asking folks if they would be willing to support. And so we didn't create materials for this. Our Partners in Equity, there are materials, there's a webpage, there's a brochure, there's all kinds of stuff that has gone out around Partners in Equity. But for this program, there were no materials created. And we made sure that folks also knew that there was no recognition in this space, that this was truly to fund the change work that we're doing within the organization. And so the results of that were, we had a starting gift of $25,000 from a donor. We were asking folks in these conversations to match that gift. And so individual gifts totaled $20,000 at the time. And we had foundation gifts come in. And one of the things that I am really proud of is that the funding that we received from foundations to support this change work within our organization included a request for stipends for our staff of color to honor the additional lived experience and emotional labor that they would have to do in the process of creating anti-racism competency within this organization. And so we received that funding. The funder believed that that was as important as we did. And so, so we've been able to use this fund to really fund this change work. And all together, I keep flashing the slide. Let's see. There we go. All together, when we have made these changes within our fundraising and how we're focusing on fundraising, our individual and organization income has increased significantly. And I would attribute that to messaging. Hang on. I would contribute that to, oh, am I showing this? Oh, I closed here. Let's hang on a second. I closed something. My mouse is out of control, everyone. Thanks for your patience. And my computer is very slow. Well, needless to say, we have increased our fundraising significantly. With our individual and organization contributions and the Anti-Racism Discretionary Fund, we went from a budget, we had budgeted in 2021 to raise $160,000, and we ended up bringing in $400,000 in that year. Let's see. I thought I had a system for keeping notes open with the slides, and the system is not working for me today. So a couple of the things that we've done when we've been making these choices, or one of the big things that we've done, is we've been using a racial equity decision-making framework so that we can be sure that all of the choices that we are making reflect our mission and our values and our commitment as an organization to racial and economic equity. And these are samples of some of the questions that we ask in that decision framework. And what I will say is, when we go through this process with any of with anything new that we are developing within our organization, it becomes very obvious when no is an answer. when no, this is not the right thing for us to do, or no, this isn't exactly what we should be doing, so that we have an opportunity then to go back to the drawing board and reconsider how we're doing work and what we're prioritizing in the work.
The one thing I'll add here is we developed this framework probably around 2018, 2019. And when we were still focused on being an organization that embedded racial equity, right? That's like it's a spectrum, right? And we had a white identified CEO. We are now majority minority. We now have leadership at every level that is Black or Latin. So we are in the process of updating this as well. You will see questions in here that while we acknowledge our historical that we were a historically white dominated organization. And so a number of these questions still apply to us because of that historical privilege. We are now Black and Latin led, and so that has a different impact. And so we're working both with our board, with the team, to have folks start to realize that that's who we are, right? And so it has positives and it has negatives in terms of the philanthropic space and what access you have and what opportunities and how those relationships are built and furthered. And so so the other thing that we're doing is we have a Latina staff member who works in the immigration space, and she's going to actually add an immigration lens to this, and so add some questions that reflect our commitment to the immigrant community as well.
Yeah, I think we were re-looking at these questions recently and realized that they really are a racial equity decision-making framework, not an anti-racist decision-making framework. And so there are updates that we are going to continue to make to these questions so that we can be more bold and creative in the work that we're doing and the changes that we're making. So last year, our largest project of the year, while we've been working to shift all of our fundraising work, we also wanted to create fundraising policies for our organization, which is different than creating a gift acceptance policy. We wanted to take it a step further and create an agreement that we would have between ourselves and our donors and our funders. And because we're a policy center, we've kept them as policies. They're modeled after the community-centric fundraising principles, and they've incorporated some of those principles. And we started working on this with our fundraising committee of the board of directors. We wanted to be sure to incorporate our organizational values. And I would be completely embarrassed to show you the first draft of these. And that is the magic of the feedback loop. The way that they have turned out, they're very bold. We've had some interesting and some good conversations with our donors and our funders about them. But this feedback loop was critical to this process so that we as an organization were not just sitting in our space and creating what we thought were policies. We included our staff, we included board members in this process, we included donors, and we included members of community, and that included people who are committed to the work of anti-racism and people who are working in the fundraising space. And so all of those folks together helped us refine and revise and redraft and rework into these 6 policies. They're on our website at kidsforward.org on the donate page. You can find them there, and there's a little more explanation about those policies, but so far so good. We sent these out to all of our donors in our year-end mailing, and we ended the year, another year where we ended it above our budget. above the budgeted amount. And we do know, every year there's donor attrition. We all have donor attrition. We did lose some donors who quietly went away. I would guess, and maybe an educated guess, that we lost a few donors because of the policies. And we had some of our donors who are committed to our change work as an organization give larger gifts to us. And so it more than made up for that change. And these are the catalysts for some really good and important conversations where we are being transparent and we are being authentic with our funders and letting them know we are willing to have challenging conversations when we need to have them, but we also want to have transformational conversations, and there is opportunity to make real change in our systems and in how we do this work as an organization. And so, so it's been working well for us. So, the elephant in the room again is the big question about, can we really create change to fundraising practices and make sure that our fundraising reflects organizational values. And I would say that so far our results as an organization have been positive. We are continuing to increase. I think I had said earlier that the modest budget that we had for unrestricted gifts was about 10% of our total budget. Currently, our unrestricted giving line is about 30% of our total budget. So we've been seeing a lot of significant increases, and they are all due to these changes. It is, we thought at the beginning that we could be risking our funding because we were doing something different and out of the box. And it ended up being the right thing to do. There's just that difference between doing the right thing and doing things right. And this ended up being doing the right thing. Instead of following a playbook that people created for us, we are creating our own and living all of it, the areas of our work and our values.
So we wanted to open up a little bit because I know that different folks have tried different things. So I don't know if folks want to share any of their experience real quick, or have a question or two for us in terms of how this has all gone. I have to say, one of the key aspects to probably doing racial equity work, but certainly doing anti-racist work, is having courage. And Nicole actually reported to our CEO when we first hired her. And she and I would chat a lot about the potential of Kids Forward in this work, but I was not her direct supervisor, COO. And I remember Ken Taylor called me in one day and he said, Nicole wants to do our annual mailing, and she has written this thing about bootstrapping and how bootstrapping is not a thing. Michele, you should read this, and I'm really worried. And I read it and I thought it was incredible to go to our 87% white, predominantly rural state, and sending the message that bootstrapping is not real. Bootstrapping is a white supremacist construct that is used not just against BIPOC folks, but against poor rural white folks, right? And so I was like, let it go. We'll see if we lose all our money this year. And we didn't. She brought in more money that year, and she helped to identify donors who had been thinking the same way. And we just didn't know. We just didn't know because we had never said the thing. And Nicole has brought that sense of courage and risk-taking to our organization at every step of the way. She is one of the few staff that deals mostly with our board, other than myself, and has really just showed great leadership and really garnered a team around her of board members and staff and donors who are super supportive. So So I don't know if folks have similar experiences they want to share, or we can flip to what this all means for our organizational budget.
I have a question to jump in. One, just really great information. And so thank you very much for sharing all of this. And yeah, it's been great. I have a question around the foundation piece, or like this is a separate fund. And so for us in doing the work, we've been integrating into our asks, both with donors, with funders, like the needing investments in these kinds of things, professional development or technical assistance and all of that stuff. We've also been trying to, we've been incorporating into asks things related to this, but in our external work, like stipends for community partners to participate, elevated or increases in translation and things like that. And we've been met with some resistance, not necessarily for those things, but just the funders speak of, yeah, we already fund you. Yeah, here's your amount. And then we just have to kind of figure it out. So I don't know if Michele or Nicole, you could speak to that strategy or the things you're doing related, like these asks with funders and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly our experience. I think the programmatic funders that we have, I definitely see we give you this amount. It's about the pie, like you just cut it up differently, right? And to most of those funders' credit, they have increased their indirect rate, right? And so you're still dealing with the same amount of money, but they allow for you more flexibility because they allow for 20% indirect or something, right? Now, that doesn't really enable for you to give a whole bunch of funding to an appropriate amount of funding to community in terms of stipends, because you have been using those funds for staff probably to get the program done. And so, so we're definitely seeing that with the programmatic funding, the restricted funding. Where we're really digging in to be innovative is with the unrestricted funders. And so Nicole has a strategy around reaching out to family foundations. And that's where moving from a transactional approach to a relational approach is really helpful, because we're building the relationships and we're going to the table with these anti-racism fundraising principles. And so far, people are really, really interested, and they're increasing the amount that they're giving us because we're able to explain what it really entails to do the work. I think there's still a lot of work to be done with philanthropy that tends to give restricted dollars on what it really what's really involved in doing the work. And hopefully over time they will adjust as well. But that was why we wound up having what we consider an interim strategy of having this discretionary fund. And we talked to folks about the discretionary fund, with donors and foundations about it, and that their funding might be allocated internally towards that fund, just so that we can honor their intention in terms of our anti-racist transition internally, or their intention around programmatic work that is anti-racist. And so, because I know those of you who handle, the nonprofit finance understand like restricted funds versus unrestricted funds, and how you can get a little trapped in what you can and cannot do in terms of, being able to give things like stipends or trained staff or, all of these things. So, like I said, I think this is an intermediary step until all of philanthropy sort of comes on board and understands exactly what it means to do racial equity work or to be anti-racist, however, they're approaching it.
One of the things that I'll add is that the conversations with current funders is different than the conversations with prospective funders. We're starting from a place of more of a mutual understanding with prospective funders, and current funders, we're trying to ask them to change. And that is really challenging. And what we have focused on, while having some flexibility in the indirect funding that they're providing, we really have just focused on changing the way that we talk to them about this work so that we can change that narrative over time, but it is going to take time to continue to do that. And there are some current funders that may be unmovable, and we'll find that out over the next couple of years.
So I will do the next bit as a bit of a teaser. And if Jasmine and you all want me to dig deeper into this aspect, some other time I can do that. Obviously, these are big chunks in terms of the fundraising, getting the revenue in, and then what do you do once you have the revenue in to also be anti-racist? So one of the first things we had to do is to get our board to understand. They understood, revenue coming in. What they didn't understand is how that happens at Kids Forward. So I had done a series of lunch and learns with our board, really helping them to understand at the time where we were at. And as Nicole mentioned, our contributions, our sort of unrestricted funding had been always pretty low at Kids Forward. We don't have a very large philanthropic ecosystem in Wisconsin. And so it's always, we've had to really develop that as well as go national. And so, we're predominantly grant driven. And then we do have an aligned Kids Forward Foundation based on a gift, like 20 years ago. And so they, give their annual 5% distribution. It winds up being about $30,000 a year. So it's not a huge foundation, but it is, something that we're able to count on every year. So we had let the board know to give it to level set what is really entailed at Kids Forward, how the funding works. You can go to the next slide, Nicole. And we had to do that because historically, I think like a lot of nonprofits, you had wound up with a few people knowing all the things about how the funding works at Kids Forward at the organization. So you had a white male CEO, you had a white male accountant, and you had a white male head of our finance committee. And they would sit once a year, and Ken would do a little bit of work on the budget, but they would sit once a year around a table and they'd, between the three of them, decide what the one pager was that they were going to bring to the board. And I began my involvement with Kids Forward on the board. And so we would literally get a one pager that was like, just high level money going out, money coming in. And then a zero, it netted zero at the bottom, right? And so when I became COO, I realized really early on I couldn't track the way I come out of government work. So I wanted to be able to track, right? And go from the high level financials all the way through to a transaction if I needed to. And I just couldn't do that. And so we did a lot of work on making things transparent. And that was both good because transparency is really important, especially if you're trying to do racial equity and anti-racism. And it was interesting because with me in leadership and then with me as a CEO, we wound up with increasing amounts of management and oversight, and the one pager went to like being able to see our entire management budget. It went to, all the supportive documentation that was needed, multiple finance committee meetings just to create the budget. And so we went through that process, and I named the fact that this was a difference from the way things had been. And in some ways it was good, and in some ways it was a little curious. And so where you can go to the next slide, where we wound up is that I created sort of some guidance that we shared across the organization, board and staff. And I introduced to people what I understood nonprofit finance to be about, which is this is a social contract. It is about a mission to the people. The people need to be at the center of everything we are doing. And that the Kids Forward budget just like we're a SPP group, so we do state budgets all the time. Just like we say for the state budget, the Kids Forward budget is a moral document. And so we have to center BIPOC folks and poor rural white folks in everything we are doing around our finance. You can go to the next slide. That also led to everyone needing to own the financial sustainability of Kids Forward. It was not just a CEO role, it was everybody's role. And so all staff are engaged in the budget process. All staff have responsibilities around the grants. We have designated grant leads, which are mostly senior level and director level folks in the organization, and they are the first line. They manage the financial budgets. They, craft what they think the proposal budget should be, and they oversee really staff time on the grants and all of those sorts of things. You can go to the next one. And then at the executive level, at the executive and director level, we have sort of higher level oversight because we can see everything across all the grants and across the organization. Ops leadership, and I saw that my operations director, Alexa Turner, joined the call. So we have our ops leadership is myself, Nicole is strategic growth director, our operations director, Alexa Turner. And then we have outsourced accounting. And so our accounting representative is also part of ops. And so we, sort of do all the deep work on financials, but we report out to the team all the time, which you'll see in just a second. And then me, I have a belief that the exec really just needs to be in charge of like 5% of the decisions in an organization. The things that are going to like cause the organization not to exist anymore, personnel, and really big financial decisions. And so in general, when staff think a grant proposal is a great idea, I have them check with the rest of their team members because we can't obligate people on the team to do something that they're not anticipating. But in general, I'm like, okay, if we're going to commit to, if you all can commit to that, we're going to do that thing. And so it's, really sort of high level things that I jump into. Next slide. So throughout this process, because of this distinction around how GAP works, right? How net zero budgeting works. We had realized that we, like many folks, right, have had extensive reserves. And what was happening is every year there was this desire by our board that we would just come to the table with a net zero because of timing of when grants come in and relationships and all of that sort of thing. We had accumulated a decent surplus and reserve, in addition to a board designated reserve that we have. And so in talking to a number of board members, we were, and really Nicole, who was like, I can't keep raising money and we're not using the money for the organization and the mission. Then we had a board member, the head of our fund development committee, who proposed this resolution, that we were in fact going to be very intentional about our transition to an anti-racist policy center. We were going to use some of our accumulated reserve for that purpose. And so what this has done from an operational perspective is that when I craft a budget with the team, we point to this and we say, okay, yes, we're not coming to the table with a net zero budget this year. We're coming to the table that on paper shows a deficit, but in fact, we have the funding. And so the board then makes a decision that is, yes, and it's written up, in the approval of that budget, that we are going to tap this accumulated reserve. And so that has really been critical to our transition and has enabled us, Nicole, you can go to the next slide, to really dig in to this collaborative budgeting. And I know we have just 4 minutes. So really the team crafts our organizational budget. I come In January, I tell the team what the board approved, which is generally what we submitted. And then July through August, we all talk about the budget, what we need, and what we think the grant revenue streams are going to be the following year. In September, the ops folks do some end of year projections, because the other agreement we have with our board is that after budgeting to revenue anticipated for the year, we budget to the prior year's surplus. And so then we, October through November, work as a full organization really to craft that. The team does a racial equity assessment on the proposed budget, and that leads the memo that comes before my memo to the board. So it is very clear to our organization and to our board that we are centering our anti-racist mission in that particular budget. So like I said, that's just a highlight. We have, this has been a multi-year process since I was a COO, and so would welcome an opportunity to share any more if folks have questions, you know, that we can't cover today. So. And we'll send out the PowerPoint so you all can see our successes and challenges.
We've got successes and challenges and some resources for where we started our learning and unlearning process.
This has been extremely informative. Thank you so much, Nicole and Michele, for sharing your transformative work with us. You have been getting a lot of kudos in the chat. I think, thank you, Nicole, for answering Michelle's question. I don't think we received any more questions in the chat, but I really appreciate you sharing your work with us. And of course, this information will be shared shortly thereafter. And of course, Michele, I would love to connect with you to see if how we can explore this more. It seems like a lot of people are interested. So thank you so much again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday. It is Thursday. Thanks so much for joining.
Everyone.